So my name is Mirabai Starr, and I live in Taos, New Mexico. So I was born in New York. I was born in Brooklyn and lived my first 11 years on Long Island. And so I was part of a kind of typical suburban New York Jewish family. And then the Vietnam War really radicalized my parents. I was born in 1961. And so both my parents, but especially my mother, became deeply engaged in the anti-war movement in the 60s, in the late 60s. And my mother was a folk singer, and we would have gatherings in our house. And my father went along with it because he was really interested and curious and open. But I would say it was really my mom who drove that train. And then in 1968, which was, I guess, the height of the Vietnam War, my older brother died of cancer. He was 10 years old. I was 7. And that really unraveled the last of the vestiges of normalcy in my family, as I said earlier when we were talking privately. And it took just a couple more years, and then my parents uprooted us from that semi-safe, conventional lifestyle. It was never really conventional, though. Like, even at that point, my mother was also an artist. There were people living with us, college students, activists. So we even in suburban Long Island, we had this kind of communal counterculture scene. And then my mom became really interested. She went back to school and became interested in alternative lifestyles and communities and things like that. So they sold the house for very little, gave everything away. It was kind of their, let's divest and do radical simplicity stage. And we bought a simple cab over camper and got on the road and traveled for about a year, which a lot of hippies were doing in those days. And my parents were slightly older than most of the hippies at that time, but it was part of that counterculture movement, the Back to the Land movement. And we traveled for a long time in Mexico, living on the beach, an isolated Caribbean beach in Mexico, now known as Cancun. There's nothing there then, in the jungle. And then we ended up in Taos because there was an alternative school here that was well known throughout the counterculture community for being a wonderful place for children. And there were 3 of us children left. I was now by default the oldest. My younger sister Amy was, so I was 11, so she was 8, and my little brother Roy was 4. And we went to school here, and it was a school that really emphasized the child's whole person and creativity and the arts and spirituality. And Taos was a real crossroads at that point. And I think it has been for thousands of years for different tribes, but in the 70s for different religious traditions that were finding new expression in America. So I was exposed from the age of 11 on to many different spiritual teachers and teachings during that time, because Taos was a place where people gathered. So I dropped out of high school for a couple of reasons. The main one being that high school was not for me. I just, I was already very much on a spiritual path. I was deeply engaged with meaning, and the high school scene did not work for me. Most of my friends were older, they were adults. And so and the other reason is because I was, as part of my spiritual path, I was following Ram Dass around, the kind of iconic American spiritual teacher. And I ended up following him to New York City, where I had come from, but where I hadn't been since my family had taken us away. And at the time, Ram Dass was involved with someone who turned out to be somewhat of a charlatan teacher named Joya. And so I lived with some friends in New York and was doing that kind of American yoga scene, although there was not so much of an American yoga scene at the time, but this was the precursor to that movement. And then I ended up in Northern California, and I got my GED. Actually, it wasn't even a GED. It was the California proficiency exam. I was living in Mendocino on my own. And so I was 16, and I started taking the community college courses, which you could take with an equivalency diploma. And I fell in love with college. And then I ended up coming back to New Mexico and went to the University of New Mexico at 18 in Albuquerque, and kept going. So I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology, which wasn't at all what I was interested in, but my boyfriend at the time, it kind of forced me into that. And then it was clear to the people in the anthropology department that I was really a philosopher. And so they shuttled me over to the philosophy department for graduate school. And I did my master's degree in philosophy and religious studies and all of my coursework for the PhD, and then decided not to pursue the doctorate. And I'm really glad I didn't, because I was able to, all my writing and teaching is in the non-academic world and is reaching many more people in the way that I want to be relevant. So I hesitate to address the question about my concept of God, because my whole spiritual life has been about deconstructing all concepts related to ultimate reality. And the minute I begin to think that I know something about God is when I now instinctively challenge myself to undo it and unknow it. And I think part of that comes from my Jewish heritage, even though my parents and grandparents were non-religious. I think there is this lineage in Judaism to question everything, including and perhaps especially our concepts of God, which transcends all understanding. And yet, now later in my life, I'm 58, I have begun to embrace a more personal, embodied experience of God, especially in the expression of the feminine face of the divine, which is so much about embodiment and reclaiming this incarnation as an example of spirit pouring into matter and rendering everything holy. And so there is this deep, earthy, sensual connectedness to the divine that I feel now that is deeply feminine. I would say that I don't have faith, and I've never had faith. I have always felt an intimacy with the divine, however. And I think my earliest experience of proximity to that was, you'll probably hear a theme of death in my conversation, in our conversation. But it was when my brother died, and I was 7 years old. And I didn't identify it at the time, of course, as any kind of religious experience, because I had no context for that. And developmentally, I probably didn't have a capacity to conceive of such a thing. But looking back, I see that the veil, which was probably only loosely in place anyway, being only 7, was removed. Or at least it became more transparent and fluid. And I was catching these glimpses of this sacred space that was so potent and mysterious and beautiful and terrifying. And I see now that that was my first real taste of the numinous. And it stayed with me always. So as the years went by throughout my childhood, I became more and more curious and connected to this presence of the sacred and to this mystery that resided or abided mostly in liminal spaces I wasn't interested in religion. Even later, when I was 11, 12, 13, and began to be exposed to yogis from India and lamas from Tibet and shamans from the Americas, and I was passionately curious about those traditions and began to experience practices that were truly enlivening and mind-altering and expanding and all of that, I still never was tempted to sign on to one particular faith tradition and define or confine my understanding of the divine in a single exclusive container. Maybe we have certain spiritual natures and temperaments. I think maybe we do. And mine has always been more interspiritual, one that has said yes to the presence of the sacred everywhere I find it, and no to an exclusive membership or understanding of God. There wasn't really a particular moment. I think that I began to believe in magic. And when I say magic, what I mean by that is that what I saw in the world, in the relative world, wasn't all there was. That there was this whole realm where spirit met matter, where people you love who died were still somehow present. And if I forward a few years, around that time, shortly after that, like 1970, I think was the year that Be Here Now came out, Ram Dass's book that introduced Eastern thought really to a Western audience, but a particularly American audience. And my parents bought the book, and I remember looking through it because it was kid-friendly because it was the square format with lots of pictures, and seeing pictures of Maharaji, Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru. So around 1970, I think it was, that Be Here Now came out, the book by Ram Dass that really introduced Eastern thought to a Western audience, especially an American audience in the 70s. And my parents bought the book, like everybody was required to do in the counterculture at the time. And I remember looking through the book, which was very kid-friendly because it was this square format with lots of pictures and drawings, and looking at these pictures of Maharaji, Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru from India, and just feeling this tremendous sense of familiarity, friendliness, and accessibility. And that stayed with me. And so then a couple of years later, when we were living in Taos, I began to see Maharaji's picture everywhere because a lot of people in Taos were Maharaji devotees. And I would say that by 13, I became a devotee of Maharaji, although I would not have named myself as such. But once again, Daniel, through a death, there was another door that swung open in spite of myself. And so when I was 13, close to 14, my first love died, Philip, in a gun accident here in Taos. And we were both 13. And at the time, that wonderful school that I spoke about that my siblings and I went to, and my boyfriend Philip and his siblings, brother and sister, that we all went to, the drama and music teachers had gone to India. They were Maharaji devotees, and they had brought back a comic book about the life of Mirabai, the 16th century poet saint, beloved of India, who worshipped Krishna, the god of love. And Mirabai had quite an extraordinary life. She was a princess. She gave it all up to follow Krishna. She was scorned by her family and beloved by her devotees. And she spontaneously, very much like Rumi, spoke and sang these love poems to God. And so there were these comic books in India about the lives of the saints and the gods and the goddesses. And so Surya and Sharada brought back this comic book about the life of Mirabai and said, let's write a play, let's write a musical. And so, and you guys, the kids, and we did. We wrote a musical play about the life of Mirabai with choreographed dances and traditional bhajans from India, chants, sacred chants, and also our own songs. And I was cast as Mirabai, and Philip was cast as Krishna. And he died that spring while we were in the midst of rehearsals. And somebody else, a girl, played Krishna in the play. But his death shattered me. He was my first love. I loved him with every fiber of my being. But it also blasted me open. And so 2 months later, when the play opened, and we performed the play at Lama Foundation, where Ram Dass had created, along with Lama people, Be Here Now. Lama was running the school at that point that I was going to. And I stepped out into that dome, that famous dome where so many hundreds of thousands of hours of prayer and spiritual practice have unfolded over the last 50 years. This was 40 years ago. I felt Mirabai inhabit me, is all I can say. And I'm not someone who makes these claims lightly. But there was, maybe it's just a resonance with my psycho-spiritual sensibilities. But there was something about this devotional, ecstatic, bhakti poet, devotional poet and singer that aligned itself with my broken, open being and came through. And, you know, I'm not really a singer, although I do sing. I love to sing, and I still sing kirtan. I still sing kirtan as a very regular part of my practice, as well as zikr in the Sufi tradition, and the Jewish prayers, and really any kind of sacred song I can get my hands on. But that was kirtan, really. That was in the Hindu tradition that I sang as Mirabai in that play, in that musical play. And it was like somebody else was singing. And I still am able to sometimes get out of my own way just enough that other being can sing through me. And it's one of the most ecstatic states that I know. So it didn't cure me from grief. I grieved hard for a long time, Philip's death. In fact, that grief made me vulnerable to some sexual predators in the spiritual scene that I was part of. And it also, because, you know, our beings are boundless in their capacity to hold these seemingly contradictory experiences of abuse and ecstatic awakening. And they were both true for me in those early years. Grief and abuse and insight and joy. And so that's kind of, that was my beginning. And I also became connected to various Sufi traditions at that time. So at 15, I left home and went with Ram Dass to New York, as I said, and ended up leaving that New York Ram Dass joyous scene because the person that I had followed there was a kind of self-proclaimed Sufi teacher. He was not sanctioned by any Sufi order, traditional, formal sanctioning as a teacher. He just took it on himself. And he was married with 2 children my age, 1 year younger and 1 year older. And he was kind of kicked out of the New York Ram Dass joyous scene. And so he was offered a caretaking position at a farm in Mendocino, California. So I went back to my family after New York, and then he invited me to come out to California and live there. And so I did, and lived on my own, but in proximity to his family. And meanwhile, we began a secret affair, which I saw later was, well, it was pretty obvious to me at the time, was not my choice. It was his. And it was, he expressed to me anyway, that I was some kind of great spiritual being, this great Ma, this embodiment of the Divine Mother, and that he was born to awaken me to who I was. And my task was to just obey him unquestioningly, and then I would wake up to who I was. And so part of that awakening, of course, was to have sex with him. And so I dropped out of school. I was separated from my family because he was cutting me off from my family because they wouldn't understand. And I was living in this little cabin in Mendocino without running water or electricity, just a little wood stove. It was cold and rainy and dark, and it was a very dark time for me. And he would come and visit me, and that was my reprieve. But this was the 70s, the mid-70s, and Jerry Brown was governor of California then, and is again all these years later, or became again the governor. But at that time, he started this alternative school program to find kids who had dropped out and offer them a pathway to get an alternative high school diploma. And so there were people who were looking for kids like me who were not going to school and finding us. And so these two kind of hippie teachers in a VW bus were driving through the woods of Mendocino, and I was found and did this alternative program for a year. And that was actually also part of my spiritual awakening. Nobody suspected, by the way, what was going on with this person who was my guide and abuser. But at the time, they too, these young teachers, were also on a spiritual path. And one of them was a student of Reb Zalman. And this was just when Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi was fresh out of Chabad and his Hasidic background, and was beginning to awaken to all these different spiritual paths. But he was still in the place where he was wanting to bring wayward Jews back to Judaism and telling us that you will find what you're looking for in the Eastern traditions right here in your own tradition. The ecstatic path, the contemplative practices, the interspiritual heart or the interfaith heart that is open to the presence of the sacred everywhere, the feminine. He was just beginning with all of this. And so that was part of my spiritual awakening, and the first hints that I could actually reclaim my ancestry that my parents had rejected without being confined to it, that I could find freedom within my own Jewish tradition. The seeds were planted then by Reb Zalman, but I was a rebellious teenager, so I was still not ready to embrace fully my Judaism, but it became part of the mix. And I continued to have this deep connection with Neem Karoli Baba, and then it began to expand to include the Sufi path. So every summer, so I lived in Mendocino for 5 years or so, 6 years, 5 years, I guess, 5 years. And every summer I would go back to Lama Foundation, where I had met this Charlatan teacher that I was living in proximity with all that time. And I would go back to Lama, and I would be staff on different spiritual retreats. So Ramdas would come, Haridas Baba, and all these different Sufi teachers, Pir Vilayat Khan, and Christian teachers like Father Thomas Keating, and these wondrous wisdom keepers. And I would serve them as staff at these retreats. So I began to really, through deep spiritual practice, because this wasn't just reading sacred scriptures and studying about these religions, this was experiencing them directly through their practices. And my heart began to open to all these other ways, and Sufism became a deep path for me at that time. And Maharaji, my connection with Maharaji continued to grow stronger. Now here's the thing, Daniel. All my teachers were men, and most of them were white men, meaning they were the pinnacle of privilege in America. And they were the carriers of these lineages that were distinctly boy-shaped. Their spiritual traditions organized, established, dominant, patriarchal religious traditions that emphasized transcendence, this kind of vertical spirituality that is all about transcending the body and the earth, about blasting up and out of our relative experience of embodiment and seeing the earth as an illusion to be awakened from. And I bought into it because life in a body was hard. I had had all these losses, and there were others, but those, the two significant losses were my brother and my boyfriend. I was being abused. I was being sexually abused. I hated sex. I hated my body. I hated him, but I couldn't admit it because he was my spiritual teacher. And so this transcendent spirituality was right up my alley. Also, not only did this masculine patriarchal sensibility emphasize transcending the body and the earth, but it was also about perfection and purification. And so that, of course, increased my self-hatred exponentially, because this body of mine was not right. And so if I just could beat the shit out of it and beat it into submission, then maybe I could get to God. And all of these practices of purification and perfection, this whole self-improvement project is designed for failure. It's designed to disparage who we are and what we have. And so it's taken me decades to recover from that kind of conditioning, that somehow I was impure and imperfect, and if I just worked hard enough, I could get right with God, and to actually reclaim and embrace my body as holy ground and this earth as sacred. And to see that it's not only about me, it's about all of us, and it's about the earth herself, and this predicament of the climate catastrophe, and the way that women and girls have been disparaged and buried, and women's wisdom has been basically erased from the religious canon across the landscape of the spiritual traditions, is intimately entwined with this disparagement of the body and this emphasis on transcendence and purification and perfection, and that the earth herself, our beloved mother, our lover, the earth herself has been the most tragic victim of that way of seeing and being. So when I was, I guess I was 19, almost 20, after I got my equivalency diploma in Mendocino and was taking community college courses, I had enough college credit to go to university. So I came back to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, which is a couple of hours south of Taos, where my family was, and went to the University of New Mexico. And the person I had been with followed me back from Mendocino to New Mexico with his wife, and his kids also had left home by that time. And he had never gotten a college degree, so he decided he'd go back to school too, although, I never mentioned he was 25 years older than I was. So if I was 20, almost 20, he was 45, right, at that time. So he went back to school. In other words, he wanted me in his sphere. He really, didn't want to let me out of his sphere of influence. So that went on for a while, and I ended up seeing in the school newspaper this semester abroad program in Spain. And I was already semi-fluent in Spanish from having traveled in Mexico with my family quite a bit when I was a child, and living in New Mexico where Spanish was spoken. And I guess instinctively I knew it was a way for me to get away from this difficult, smothering relationship. So I applied and I was given a scholarship, and off I went to Seville, Spain, in the Andalusia, southern Spain, when I was 20. And that was a huge awakening for me. And I studied Spanish literature in Spanish in Spain. And I was studying flamenco, because Sevilla is the flamenco capital of the world, really. And I was going to Granada, which is where the Alhambra is. And I was experiencing firsthand the confluence of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in Spain. I mean, the convivencia, that period, that 800-year period in Spain when Jews, Christians, and Muslims all collaborated on some of the greatest works of art and architecture and philosophy and science and spirituality, was still present in the land, in the architecture, in the culture and the arts in southern Spain. And because of my connection with Sufism, I saw it and felt it everywhere. And, Christianity had been the one religion that had been absent from my interspiritual education. So Hinduism, Buddhism, I forgot to mention Buddhism, I had developed a Buddhist meditation practice at around 15 through my exposure to Vipassana teachers at Lama Foundation. And I had been meditating ever since. And so Hinduism with Neem Karoli Baba and various flavors of Buddhism and various streams of Sufism, certainly the native and indigenous traditions because of the Taos Pueblo influence here where I grew up. And the Taos Pueblo people were very much spiritual advisors to the counterculture hippies of Taos, the Back to the Land movement. And then, of course, my mystical Jewish inclinations were present and becoming more present in my life as I went along. But Christianity was the one religion I knew very little about and had the deepest allergy to, because growing up even in a non-religious Jewish family, there was this sense that Christianity was dangerous. And the whole Jesus thing, not only was Christianity dangerous, but the Jesus thing was insipid to my family. And so I couldn't mention any interest in Jesus or in Christ, even though I was beginning to develop an interest in Christ and Christ consciousness and Jesus' social justice teachings, the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes especially. I was being exposed to all that at that time. So anyway, there I was in Spain, and there were these three Abrahamic traditions very much present, especially Islam. And I began to become very interested in the way in which the heart of all the world's great spiritual traditions is one. And I had always been. In fact, I wrote a letter to Reb Zalman when I was 15, explaining why I couldn't sign on to Judaism because I was a bridge builder. Yeah, I was 16. I was a bridge builder. And my teacher, Yehuda, who was one of those young hippie teachers, 35 years later, sent me that letter. For some reason, it was in his possession. He sent it to me. I have it. It was like, even then, I knew that my task in this life was not to set my roots down in one holy house, but to open the doors and to travel between them and to build bridges or help create paths between them. It was, even then, I think I knew that. But in studying Spanish literature, I encountered San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, the great 16th century Spanish mystic who wrote these exquisite love poems to God and who coined the term dark night of the soul and wrote this exquisite spiritual masterpiece that was based on a poem, one of his spontaneous love poems, La Noche Oscura del Alma, the night of the soul, the dark night of the soul. Canciones del Alma, songs of the soul. And then from this beautiful erotic poem about the secret rendezvous of lover and beloved in the garden, which I always pictured as the gardens of the Alhambra in Granada, where I would go on the bus from Sevilla. I'd go from Sevilla to Granada alone on the bus with my little bamboo flute that I'd bought from Sachdev, the great Indian flutist who died recently. And I would go to the Alhambra and I would play my bamboo flute in the gardens. Now you have to like wait online for 11 hours, get your tickets 10 years in advance. This is hyperbole, but you can't get into the Alhambra anymore. But anyway, I would go there and I would experience this landscape. And so when I read John of the Cross and these poems about the secret rendezvous of lover and beloved in the garden, I was there. I was in those gardens. It was so alive for me. And I began to investigate this love that San Juan de la Cruz had for his beloved through the lens of the Christian mystical tradition. And that planted a seed that began to flower. So I went back to school. I went on and got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in religious studies, and I wrote my master's thesis on John of the Cross and the paradox of the expression of the ineffable. Meaning, this is the thing, this goes back to your first question, Daniel, about my experience of faith and how my experience of faith is much more about unknowing than it is about knowing. And that's the dark night of the soul. That it's not about having a difficult time. It's about being stripped of all that keeps us from a direct encounter with the Holy One, unmediated through sense or intellect, a naked, intimate beingness with the divine. And that's what the dark night of the soul is about. But the paradox is that mystics of all traditions, and I've since confirmed this again and again and again across the religious landscape, claim that their experience of communion with the One, with the Holy, their experience of lover melding into beloved and any sense of separation dissolving, even though it's often fleeting and momentary, those mystical encounters, defy all description, all conception, all language. Language is utterly inadequate to describe what happened when lover melted into beloved. And yet, what do the mystics do? They cannot help themselves but express the inexpressible through mystical poetry, through this outpouring of love language. And so that paradox already at 20, I don't know, by the time I did my master's degree, I was 22, is the essence of the mystical experience. We have these moments of union and communion with the beloved. They transcend language and concepts, and yet it can't help but be expressed in all of these ways that are non-discursive. So whether it's poetry or visual art or music, we are impelled to sing that song of union. And so I wrote my master's thesis on that. Then the charlatan Sufi teacher and I, at that point, he finally left his wife, and we pretended I was 22. We pretended that now that I was an adult, I'd been with him since I was 15, we suddenly realized that we were in love, even though we had been having this secret affair all along. Nobody knew, not one single person. There was no one I could confide in. And by the way, the reason there was no one I could confide in was because he had convinced me that if anyone knew, this very subtle yet crucial spiritual reality that was woven by our love would come undone and would be dangerous to the cosmos itself. It was a matter of cosmic life and death. So finally, he ends his relationship with his wife of 25 years or whatever it was. Long time. And we pretend that we just discovered we're in love, and we get married. And we started an alternative high school here in Taos. And it was very much modeled on my elementary school, and also an alternative high school where I taught in California with another chapter. And that was actually a really wonderful school. But early, just a few years into that, I was able to leave that relationship. And the sky did not fall. Or as I say in my memoir, Caravan of No Despair, the sky did fall, and I lived under a fallen sky. And it was okay. And I reclaimed my life. At that point, we had adopted two abused kids from the foster system. And I, because of his crazy behavior after I left, I got full custody of the kids and raised them myself. And I had to find a job, and I was able to get a job teaching philosophy and religious studies at the University of New Mexico Taos branch, which just started. That was its first year, 1993, here in Taos, and start my own life. But after I ended that relationship, because so much of my spiritual life had been entwined with him and his teachings and his bullshit, really, I tried, Daniel, to completely cut off my spiritual life. It was like it was all meaningless. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be true because so much of it was about him, or had happened in his presence. So I fired God. I dumped Krishna, and I decided to pursue sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which was what all my friends had done in their teens and early 20s, and I had bypassed, and I was gonna go back and do all that and do it right. So drugs didn't interest me, and sex interested me, but it was still, I wasn't able to be as promiscuous as I wished I could. I was still someone whose heart was so permeable that the minute I would connect with someone intimately, they would become Krishna, whether I liked it or not, for me. And so that's, and rock and roll. Oh, and then I ended up, connecting with a singer-songwriter who became my best friend, and going on the road with her and falling in love with her bass player. And so I got to do all of that for a while. And then little by little, I realized there was no way to divorce myself from my spiritual life. It is who I am. It was who I was. And yet it had to all come undone. That dark night of the soul that I had read about and spoken about and taught about had to happen in a new and deeper iteration. By the way, I believe that our dark nights of the soul, those unraveling periods, of those dismantlings, happen cyclically, periodically. It's not like a one-shot deal. Just like enlightenment, I don't believe anymore is a singular experience, that there are awakenings and there are unravelings. There are meltings that need to occur from time to time when our lives become calcified. Or even if they don't, it's not like there's something wrong and therefore we have to have a dark night of the soul. But I do believe that there are multiple experiences of letting it all go and letting it all come tumbling down, and being in that dismantled space, abiding and surrendering to those times of unknowingness, radical unknowingness. And so that was necessary. And I couldn't direct it. I couldn't direct my reclaiming of my spiritual life either. It happened organically. And it happened through Neem Karoli Baba, through Maharaji. Because here in Taos, there is a Neem Karoli Baba ashram and a Hanuman temple. And Ram Dass had commissioned this murti, a statue of Hanuman, this giant, beautiful marble statue. I should take you there. Of Hanuman to come to America. And a local devotee had volunteered for it to be delivered here to Taos, and he'd keep it in his barn until a proper temple was built elsewhere, New York or California or somewhere where people could come. And it would be a Neem Karoli Baba place for the people who had been with Neem Karoli in India or who just were devotees to be able to come. And it ended up staying here, and a temple was built around it. And so my youngest daughter was 4, and I was a single mom, and I began to go over to the ashram because those were my spiritual roots, and sing kirtan. And I would bring Jenny with me, and there were other little kids her age, and there was community, there was family, and there was sacred singing, and there was a feeling of India, but India and America that was it just felt like home. And so little by little, my children and I became, not so much my older daughter Daniela, she wasn't into it, but my younger daughter Jenny definitely was, and that became my spiritual home. And I reclaimed my connection with Maharaji in such a way that I was able to breathe again. Because trying to suppress or repress or deny my spiritual life was, it took the life out of me, and I came alive again. And I eventually met my current husband, who is a Neem Karoli Baba devotee who I had seen on and off for years. His daughter his youngest daughter was the same age as my youngest daughter, and they were friends. So it was through the friendship between our daughters that we became friends, and eventually ended up living together, and our daughters became sisters. So when I met Gangadas, my husband, and we got together with our 2 families, we blended our 2 families. We had 5 daughters between us, but the older 3 were out of the house pretty much by then. And we were raising our 2 younger daughters together. And I was rooted in this spiritual family of the Neem Karoli Baba lineage, and also starting to become more connected to my Jewish community and doing the high holy day services with my very eclectic Jewish community here in Taos, and still had my daily Buddhist meditation, mindfulness meditation practice, and periodic ecstatic connection with my various Sufi communities. My spiritual life was alive and well. My domestic life was flourishing. It was in the first healthy relationship of my life. Our kids were happy and thriving. My youngest daughter, Jenny, was killed very suddenly in a car accident when she was 14. It was her first year in high school. And she was starting to really separate from me, this child who had been, maybe because I adopted her at such a young age when she was so much needing mommy and I so much needed a little girl. We were very entwined. And that last few months of her life was that time when she was starting to individuate, and it was painful. And in the middle of that individuation process, she died. You know, it's like Gangadas, my husband, often says, you know, every teenager, most teenagers go through that process, but most of them make it through. And Jenny didn't. She also had some mental illness issues that were just beginning to show themselves. Her birth mother was severely bipolar and had been hospitalized on and off throughout her life. And Jenny was young to manifest those symptoms, but she was starting to go into these manic states, and that she died in one of those, really the onset of that mania. And my life came apart again in a way that I could never have imagined. I mean, my divorce was actually incredibly enlivening. It was a dark night of the soul in the sense that everything had to come undone, but it was also a very joyous reclamation of my soul. Jenny's death was the end of my life, and it was the beginning of my spiritual life. Even though I'd been on a spiritual path since I was 15, I was 40 when Jenny died. I see now that was the day that my spiritual life really began, in the sense that all my ideas about God and spirituality and gurus and belonging were flimsy nothing, and they lit on fire and blew away. In fact, they took with them the entire landscape of my life, which just burned to the ground. I know this sounds dramatic, but I know every parent who's lost a child knows exactly what I'm saying. It's nothing can survive that devastation, and it didn't. I mean, my marriage survived miraculously, because I remember in the early weeks and months saying, how could he live with me? Nobody could live with this. Because Jenny was not his child. He loved her. He was her stepfather. He was a devoted stepfather. But we'd only been together 5 years at that point. It wasn't the same for him. It was for her stepsister, though, Kali, Gangadas's daughter, my stepdaughter. For Kali, Jenny's death was as much, as devastating as it was for me. So the day that Jenny died was the day that my first book came out. And my first book was a translation of John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul. So he wrote the poem originally, and then he wrote this prose treatise on the teaching of this spiritual dismantling, really the essence of the transformational power of suffering. And so those two things coincided to the minute, really. Again, I write about this in my memoir, Caravan of No Despair, how literally the police came to the door to tell me that my daughter had just been killed in an accident a half an hour after UPS had delivered my book, my first book, Dark Night of the Soul. So my own spiritual experience and my teachings about the spiritual path were completely informed by the confluence of these two things. This book, Dark Night of the Soul, and this unbearable loss. And ironically, I started receiving speaking invitations and teaching workshops and retreats, invitations to do all this because of this book, Dark Night of the Soul, and because of the introduction that I wrote, which Father Thomas Keating, the father of centering prayer, a single conversation I had with him kind of created this whole introduction that now has been passed around by tens of thousands of people as an introduction to this teaching of Dark Night of the Soul. And so I started getting all these invitations, and I couldn't do it because I knew that in the wake of Jenny's death, my job was to be completely present with that for a period of time and turn inward, not go outward. And so, informed by Jewish wisdom about the traditional year of mourning, a full year of mourning, I withdrew from the world, except my university classes. I would just go teach and I'd come home. I'd take walks in the mountains. And other than that, any kind of social engagement or any kind of public discourse was out of the question. And I did that ritual year of mourning. And I had, thank you, Goddess, been given a book contract to translate The Interior Castle by Santa Teresa de Ávila, Saint Teresa of Ávila, John of the Cross's mentor, his teacher, his guru. And even though I wasn't particularly interested in her, I had accepted this contract before Jenny died. And they gave me the opportunity to break my contract, but because of what I had just been through, but I opted to do it. And so for that year of mourning, I translated The Interior Castle by Saint Teresa of Ávila, and she saved my life. And then I started coming out and teaching. So the very thing that originally, years before, had turned me off to Teresa of Ávila was her emphasis on God in form. Like John of the Cross was all about the formless, the transcendent, the absolute that is beyond all conception and all language and all containment. That really spoke to me. But Teresa of Ávila, her emphasis on claiming God right here, I felt was counter to my non-dual inclinations. But it turned out that Teresa's teachings on the intimacy of God as beloved, not only here in this world, but in the center of our own being, was the most radically invitational, healing teaching I could possibly have received and had the opportunity to share with others. So for Teresa of Ávila, the Holy One would choose nowhere to dwell, except in the center of our own being. Why? Because that's the most beautiful place in all of creation. Not to be nice to us, but because God is so passionately in love with us that God chooses to be as close as God can possibly be, which is in the center of our own being. And therefore, the path to union with the beloved is simply to turn inward. No special rituals or intermediaries or ordained official representatives required. Simply to allow ourselves to be with the one we love in the center of our own being, that beautiful garden of our heart. And that was that invitation to embody that lover-beloved relationship was comforting, was risky for me as a non-dual contemplative type. It was a big risk to say yes to that intimate presence. And then, of course, over the years, what I began to realize is that Teresa's teachings were quintessentially feminine. So rather than being this transcendent, vertical, ascending this ladder up and out of this world, it was about fully inhabiting this world, this body, this experience of my own humanity as the very portal that connects me to my beloved, and for all of us. Teresa was very practical. She was funny. She was smart. She was warm. She was outrageous. She gave me permission to be all those things. That my idea of piety and connectedness was so other than that. All about leaving the personality behind. Her personality was huge and juicy and in some ways embarrassing to me, because she wanted people to like her and she was open about that. All the things I had been trained not to do, she did. And yet she was so real and so connected to God as beloved. And because of the warmth of her presence, I actually felt her with me as an ally, as like a favorite aunt that I could have tea with. Translating is an amazing spiritual practice in itself. Translating a mystic or a saint or a wisdom keeper is to have darshan. Darshan in the Hindu tradition is to sit at the feet of the guru and receive direct transmission. And that's what I felt like as a translator of the Spanish mystics, John of the Cross and Teresa of Ávila. And then much later, Julian of Norwich, the Middle English mystic. It's to have a direct relationship with that being and to receive their transmission in every cell of my body. I love being a translator. It's such an honor. So there was no special moment of awakening around Jenny's death or where I went from there. There wasn't some, dramatic experience of Jenny coming to me and telling me what's what, or there was no point at which I woke up from the dream of grieving and realized that I was whole again. It's been a very gradual integration of that catastrophic life experience with my own spiritual coming of age. It's been gradual, it's been organic, it's been fraught with just my messy humanity, which I have claimed as the very dwelling place of my spirituality. And it's true that being called to teach these things, like to be someone who transmits these wisdom teachings that I've had the privilege of gathering from all these different spiritual traditions, has demanded that I stay awake in some ways. And because I'm not interested in recapitulating the same old insights, I continue to be present to my own unknowing every step of the way. Like every time I start to think I've got my shit together, spiritually speaking, I chuckle to myself and allow it to be taken away again. And so I think that keeps both my teaching and my own practice much more alive. Like my latest spiritual awakening over the last couple of years has been around power and privilege and racism and the ways that the progressive white spiritual communities in which I primarily find myself teaching are fraught with unconscious white supremacy. And so I've become very interested in gentle, loving, but also fierce, uncompromising, truth-telling ways of inviting all of us, including myself, to begin recognizing and dismantling those unconscious racist structures inside ourselves so that we can put our money where our mouth is, spiritually speaking. We can't just talk about being one. When vast swaths of the human family are not experiencing the privilege of their oneness. And so that's part of my journey of staying awake and keeping my heart open, is to stay connected to the suffering of humanity and to the shadow parts that are there and that run the show unless we are willing to face them. And the spiritual, a lot of American spiritual communities are kind of in this coma of, let's engage in positive thinking and what is it called? That, like, if we just ask for what we want, then we'll manifest it. And I'm just not interested in our getting what we want. I'm interested in our standing up for those who are marginalized and engaging in acts of justice that don't take us away from our spiritual lives, but are the very expression of being a spiritually engaged human being. And I think that's really rooted in my Jewish heritage too. This social justice consciousness, this understanding that the only way we can know the unknowable God is through our relationships with one another. And I would add, with the earth herself. Oh, Jesus. Oh, him. So when I fell in love with John of the Cross in Spain when I was 20, later, fast forward 10 years, when I started teaching at the university, philosophy and religious studies, I, of course, had to teach Dark Night of the Soul because it was the single most transformational, sacred writing that I knew of. And I had, at that point, studied in many of them. And so I was teaching Dark Night of the Soul in my college philosophy classes, and my students were not getting it at all and were completely bored. And so a colleague and dear friend of mine, a Zen teacher named Sean Murphy, said, why don't you translate Dark Night of the Soul? There are all these new translations coming out of these mystical classics and other traditions, especially Rumi and the Sufi wisdom beings at that time. So I don't see anyone doing the Christian mystics particularly. Why don't you try this one? Because you're fluent in Spanish. You love language. I had written a couple of bad novels at that point. And you love this text. It's a perfect combination. And he had just won the Hemingway Award for first novel, Sean had. And with that award, he had been given a New York agent. He said, let me ask my agent what he thinks. And the agent said, well, have her write a one-page kind of description of the text, and I'll take a look at it and see if I can recommend something. So I did. He did. He took me on as a client, sold the book in 2 weeks, which I thought, oh, that's nice. Little did I know how rare that was, but it was the right thing at the right time. I just got lucky. So I received a book contract to translate Dark Night of the Soul from Penguin and Riverhead, which at the time was the spiritual imprint of Penguin. And I also did the Interior Castle with them. And then because of those 2 books, these 2 spiritual classics, Dark Night of the Soul and the Interior Castle, and all the teaching and speaking engagements that came out of that, I kept getting book offers to translate Christian mystics and to write about the Christian mystics. And suddenly I found myself as a Jewish Sufi with a Hindu guru and a Buddhist meditation practice and a pagan inclination, really, as this, the contemporary translator and commentator on the Christian mystics. And I had no identification with Christ as my path. But I certainly fell in love with the Christian mystics and really appreciated their love of Christ. And when Jenny died, so Jenny died after Dark Night of the Soul came out while I was translating and then I began translating The Interior Castle, and then all these other books on the Christian mystics unfolded, and I didn't stop grieving after my traditional 1 year of mourning in the Jewish mourning container. But I realized several years in to the very organic grieving process that is still going on 17 years later, that my work with the Christian mystics had been sustaining me all along. And that through these great wisdom beings, I had both encountered and fallen in love with their beloved Christ. And that Christ was an integral part of my healing and of the opening of my heart. The ability, the capacity that I had to, as Ram Dass says, keep my heart open in hell, wasn't in spite of these Christian wisdom teachings, but because of them. And I was like, oi, the Christians, why? Why have I been given this karma that I am like the Christian mystic person in America? That's not, I don't want that. My Jewish grandmother would be horrified. But finally, took me a long time kicking and screaming. Finally, I was compelled to surrender and admit that I was madly in love with Christ and that the Christ path was one of the vital, luminous strands that wove the basket of spirit that sustains me, and also that I am privileged to share with others. I can't tell you how many Christians have said, you have given Christ back to me. You've given my tradition back to me. I had distanced myself from it, and now I see how vital and alive it is. So, of course, when I'm speaking about the feminine, I'm speaking about that quality, that reality across the gender spectrum. The feminine in women, the feminine in men, the feminine in people of all genders. And that's what I think people of all genders are thirsting for, is the feminine, because the masculine has kind of run its course and has become dry and fossilized and, in fact, somewhat dangerous, has done some harm, done great good, but has also been responsible for some of the most intractable structures of suffering across the human community, in religion, in politics, in the sciences and technology. So that's important to just state that I'm speaking about the feminine as a reality that has nothing to do with just our male and female bodies, but is rather a kind of aggregate of attributes that are rooted in the body, that are about embodiment, that are about relationality, how we relate to each other, that we relate to each other, emotion, feeling, sensuality, about recognizing our interdependence rather than our individual heroic personality traits or sets of skills. So the feminine is about recognizing out the way in which everything is interconnected, and we are all interconnected, and that we all have something to bring to the table, and that nobody is more special than anybody else. And so emphasizing those qualities of interconnectedness and relationship and mutual affirmation is a task that we all have, and that we're all called in some like prophetic, powerful way to embody right now. That there is wisdom in feelings, in emotions, in relationships, in the body itself, that the masculine paradigm has denied for millennia, and that embodied relational feeling-centered wisdom is what's needed to save us from the brink of extinction. And therefore, yes, men, women, people of all genders can emphasize and center those values in everything that we do. And I'm really moved by the ways in which many men, privileged white men, are voluntarily abdicating their own power in order to emphasize these feminine realities and hold them up and lift them up and support them, and are stepping back and allowing these feminine voices to be centered and to be prominent. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of humility. It's interesting, I'm interviewed a lot about this, and many podcasts, I've done a lot of podcasts, and I would say 90% of them are white men's podcasts. And they are all hungry for this feminine wisdom and so willing to step back and allow that to emerge. And every once in a while, I actually have been interviewed by women who are just recapitulating the patriarchy and are being just as bossy and controlling and ego-centered as the men that they purport to be replacing. So it's not just about women doing what the dudes have done. It's about all of us reclaiming our interconnectedness and the power of loving kindness. And not just those soft, kind of traditionally feminine qualities of compassion and loving kindness and mercy and unconditional forgiveness and all of those things that definitely belong to the feminine, but also the ferocity, the wildness, the overflowing creativity that can look like chaos, and the rule breaking, the subversive elements of the feminine that disrupt those structures that are so entrenched and so rule bound and legislated. You know, the feminine turns it all upside down, breaks it all open. It's messy. It's not pretty always. That aspect of the feminine also is what is needed right now. My dogs. Okay, what am I most grateful for? Yes, I would say these really intimate relationships of the people who are closest to me. My husband is my great tree, I call him. He gives me shelter. He roots me. He feels like home, even though we're apart a lot. I travel a lot, and I'm constantly in free fall in a way. Like I'm on an airplane. I'm in a new city. I'm in a new landscape with new people, new food, new beds. It's like my life is very up in the air, unrooted in some ways, ungrounded. And just his love grounds me and makes me feel like I can do all of that because I I can come home to that refuge. And I have it every day, even if we're not physically together. Similarly, my animals, my dogs, especially Lola and Ruby, and their unconditional love. And they're so smart, and they're so tuned in. And yes, I'm a total animal person, and so my animals are really important to me. The ravens that live in the dead tree outside the yard, and every evening when I go out onto the porch, they come one by one and call to me and land, and I call back to them, and we have this friendship. It's like wherever I go, that wild animals and the domesticated animals become part of my heart, and I am so grateful for my relationship with animals. Also, my family of origin they are my favorite people. My father's no longer alive, but I still feel really connected to him. But my mother and my sister and brother are my best friends and integral to my everyday life. Like yesterday I knew we were all getting together, and I remember in the morning waking up going, oh, good, I get to see my mom and brother and sister today and have a meal and catch up. And it was like this feeling of, oh, I can do anything, knowing that they're there in my life, and then I get to have them. And I have a group of really close friends, women, mostly women friends, although a gay male priest who I call my other husband, who was part of that circle. And so these relationships, I'm so grateful for the way that they know me and love me anyway, and are tracking me as I enter into these unknown landscapes that my work keeps bringing me to. These people who love me are just, I can't imagine how people could navigate their lives without these loved ones that are part of our everyday lives. And people in America, especially in the developed world, are often so isolated. And a lot of people are really separate from their families, like their families of origin. Their families of origin are the problem that they solved and disconnected from, then became who they really are. And for me, there's nothing in me that's not integrally part of my family. I am who I am because they are who they are. So my greatest wish is that humanity wakes up from its dream of separateness and recognizes that we belong to each other, and that we belong to our mother, the earth, and that because she is a cherished relative, we must do everything we can to heal and protect and lift her. And that belongingness to each other is also our belongingness to the earth that sustains us. And this illusion of separation that we have created and perpetuated is one that we are fully capable of awakening from. And the way that I think we'll wake up is through the awakening of the feminine heart. My wish is that we do that, and we do it together, and that we realize that we can't do it alone. We can only do it together. It seems like the message I've been given to share in this life is that the mystery is not a problem to be solved. It's a beautiful reality to be embraced. And so every time we become attached to thinking that we know what's important and what's true, who's right and righteous and who's wrong and unjust, that all of these conceptual constructs that we get fixated on are fluid realities meant to dissolve and dissolve again, leaving us in this vast realm of the heart that isn't about what we think we know. It's about unknowing so that we can have a true, intimate, naked encounter with what is, which is love. Oh my God, you're so wise and insightful, Daniel. These questions are so alive. Oh, okay. My childlike wonderment. That so with all the tragedy I've had in my life, and I've only given you some of it, one might conclude that I would be a very serious, solemn, dark creature. Even spiritually, what would be the word? Galvanized by my pain into this idea of a wise person. And instead, I am rather like a child. I don't think that I have any special mastery of anything, but my capacity for joy and wonder has been increased vastly, not in spite of, but through my suffering. So my childlike wonderment.